about Hamlet. Now, Hamlet is, of course, a very rich text, or we wouldn't still be talking about it more than 400 years after it was written, and there are many ways in which it can be enjoyed and in which it can be understood, and we'll just be touching on a few over the next 6 weeks. Each time, each episode, a different member of the team here at the Institute will present a different aspect of the play. For the remainder of this introductory episode, I'll be talking about the publishing history of the play and its relation to the play as a performance and indeed as a film. In the next episode, we'll be looking at Hamlet in its own time as a revenge tragedy with Dr. Martin Wiggins, who's a leading authority on the Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre, other revenge plays and Hamlet's relation to them. From there, Hamlet in its own time in relation to medical and psychological thinking, as Dr. Erin Sullivan, who's a specialist in the history of the emotions, looks at Hamlet and melancholy. From there we begin to look at the subsequent performance history of the play, what it can mean live now, as Dr. Abigail Rokeson, who's one of the theatre and performance specialists here at the Institute, looks at the different approaches that have been taken by modern directors and actors, and we'll be going to Elsinore Castle, where Abigail helped to produce a special site-specific performance of Hamlet in 2010, some of which we'll be seeing. From there, back here to Stratford and the Royal Shakespeare Company. I'll be talking to Jonathan Slinger, who played Hamlet in the 2013 production of the play, about what it feels like to play Hamlet, what the role has come to mean to him. And after that, we finish with Professor Ewan Fernie talking to Pippa Nixon, who's played Ophelia in the 2013 production, about the to be or not to be speech in particular, and about what it might mean for a woman to play Hamlet. So there'll be plenty for you to read, plenty for you to think about, and I hope you'll enjoy the course. Well, very good. Here we are in the hall of the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford, where I'm standing with the small tip of a very large iceberg. We have a library here containing 50,000 items that have been hand-chosen since 1951, and a huge number of them relate to Hamlet, whether they're texts of the play, essays about the play, books about the play, film versions of the play, things relating to film versions and stage versions of the play, and so on. And all I want to do with this little pile in front of us is, one, give you the sort of basic facts about where we get our texts of Hamlet from, the 3 things you need to know about Hamlet as we have it from about 1600, and then to raise the question, which versions of Hamlet do you know? Which version of Hamlet? Which is the real one? Because it is actually quite complicated. Right, we'll start then in Shakespeare's own lifetime, and the first thing you really need to know about Hamlet is that Shakespeare didn't make up the story, as he didn't make up the stories for most of his plays, apart from apparently from The Tempest. Hamlet is a very old legend. It had been written down in Latin in the early Middle Ages, and there's a version of it that Shakespeare possibly knew at first hand, possibly at second hand, that was published in France in 1582, in which the hero is called Amlet, as you might expect. It's very violent. The hero pretends to be an idiot. He changes his death sentence when he's sent to England, something like as we have it in the play, but it's a complete bloodbath when he gets back. He burns down the usurper's court. They're having a party to celebrate the fact that he's dead, and he pretty much kills the lot of them and declares himself king. He does not die at the end. Now, Shakespeare also knew an earlier play about Hamlet, in existence probably in 1589. It was probably written by Thomas Kyd, of whom we'll be hearing more later in a subsequent episode. It was a revenge tragedy, and it included the ghost. This missing play, it's sad but we don't have a text of it, had a ghost in it who cried out Hamlet revenge at some point in the script. That's one of the only things that we've got written down about this one. Right, well, let's start with a book. Now, in 1603, we get our first printed text of Shakespeare's Hamlet, the book which later in its life gets called the Bad Quarto. It's the shortest version of Hamlet to date from Shakespeare's own time, and it's listed as, this is what the title page calls it, The Tragical History of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, by William Shakespeare, as it hath been divers times acted by his highness servants in the city of London, as also in the two universities of Cambridge and Oxford, and elsewhere. So this is offering itself as the souvenir book of a very successful stage show, which has been played in London by this important theatre company, which has toured, and which is written by somebody who's already a very famous scriptwriter, William Shakespeare. Now, this inspires demand for a better version, because it appears, in retrospect, to be a bit garbled. The same printer puts out, in 1604, this book, what's now called the Good Quarto of Hamlet, which, again, is the tragical history of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, by William Shakespeare, but this time it adds to the title page this phrase, newly imprinted and enlarged to almost as much again as it was, according to the true and perfect copy. So what they're claiming is that this is much longer and it's better, it's more accurate, and that's certainly how it looks. It is indeed almost as long again as it was. It takes about 4 hours if you perform every word in here, and various odd features of the first quarto have been straightened out. To be or not to be no longer begins to be or not to be, I there's the point. Polonius is no longer called Carambis. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are no longer called Rosencraft and Guilderstone. It looks as though the first quarto was a bit hasty, a bit botched, and this is the long version. Now, somebody, however, shortened it. It's too long to perform if you do all of it, as I've said, and by the time Shakespeare's friends Hemming and Condell put out a complete edition of Shakespeare's plays after he's dead in 1623, Hamlet has been tidied up even more. In the folio, this volume, the Hamlet they print on this nice big folio paper has been shortened a bit, apparently so that you can perform it. One whole soliloquy has gone. How all occasions do inform against me has been taken out. There are lots of other cuts, but every now and then there are some new passages, as though Shakespeare's had another idea or as though he just wants to write in a new transition to cope with some of the cuts. Now, as a result, most copies of Shakespeare's Hamlet that you read now, including the one we're supplying with this course, actually bring together all the stuff we think is by Shakespeare in the second quarto, which is all of it, and all the extra bits that are just in the folio. And this produces some interesting problems for anybody who's printing Shakespeare's Hamlet. What do you do with all the stuff that's in the first quarto, with Carambis, with that alternative version of To Be or Not to Be, with all the extra bits of dialogue that we don't get in either of the two versions that we think are better? What are we going to do with a play which, by the time you've put this one together with this one, is much too long to act in a theatre? It's 4.5 hours or so if you do a conflated text of both of these. And what's lying around me are some answers to these questions. The Arden edition, for instance, the most recent Arden, simply reprints all three of them separately from one another. So you buy a copy of Hamlet and you get 3 different plays, each called Hamlet. When the complete Oxford edition of Shakespeare edited Hamlet in 1986, this nice big book here, they follow the folio text, but then also give you all the stuff that's in the Good Quarto that the folio leaves out at the end. So you think you've read the whole play of Hamlet, and then you get these things called additional passages in rather jumbled effect at the end. And they are quite long. They occupy, 2 or 3 more pages. And then there are other solutions too to the question of what we want from a version of Hamlet. For one thing, one of the things we might want from a version of Hamlet is actually a souvenir of the version we saw in the theatre. From the first text onwards, there's an uneasy relation between the book of Hamlet, the printed text, and the performance, which perhaps is what you'd expect from a play in which texts are forever being rewritten. The whole plot of the last act of Hamlet depends on Hamlet rewriting the commission for his execution, which has been given to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And when Hamlet himself puts on a play, when he has the actors who come to Elsinore act the murder of Gonzago, he himself rewrites the script, gives them a different version. And lots of these versions reflect the differences between reading Hamlet and seeing it acted. Lots of these versions reflect the differences between reading Hamlet and seeing it acted. By 1676, for example, when this text comes out, Hamlet is back on the stage as a very popular play, and the book again sells itself as the book of the show, the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, as it is now acted at His Highness the Duke of York's Theatre. And the book wants to be faithful to the stage show, but wants to be faithful to the printed text as well. So it comes with a little warning at the beginning to the reader. This play, being too long to be conveniently acted, such places as might be least prejudicial to the plot or sense are left out upon the stage, but that we may no way wrong the incomparable author are here inserted, according to the original copy, with this mark, an inverted comma, and you get inverted commas in the margin, so that while you're reading this book, you're continually being reminded that actually there's lots of stuff in it that you can leave out if you're performing it, so that the book is perhaps better than the live performance, but also you're being reminded that it doesn't actually correspond to the live performance, that you're only reading a book, it's not the show at all. And a surprising number of printed Hamlets bear witness to live productions that they know they can't quite give you. Another thing printed texts of Hamlet like to do is give you pictures. Even where they're giving you a stage text, they might want to give you a picture that you can't otherwise have. This rather lovely book from 1800, which we'll see the actress Pippa Nixon using later on, is the acting version used by John Philip Kemble in about 1800, and also used by his sister Sarah Siddons, who's one of the first female Hamlets. So it's giving you only a short version of the play, as currently seen in the theatre, but you get, as a special bonus, a picture of Ophelia drowning, the scene that you don't get in the theatre, because obviously it's very inconvenient to bring a river on stage. We only hear about Ophelia drowning, we don't actually get it in the play. And many other texts like to give us pictures of things we couldn't possibly quite see in the theatre. Of course, the most famous painting based on Hamlet is Millet's painting of Ophelia drowning, the thing you've never seen done live, unless you're exceptionally lucky. And even copies of Hamlet that are designed solely to be read, apparently without reference to what's happening in the theatres, like to remind you of scenes in the play. This is a beautiful illustrated Shakespeare, illustrated by Meadows. This is a big copy of Charles Knight's, and the frontispiece to the whole thing is this picture of Johnston Forbes Robertson, as though while you're reading Hamlet, you might want to remember what an actor playing Hamlet looks like. Then again, there are texts of Hamlet that exist solely because it's been performed or enacted in some way. This big folder under here, for example, is the actual shooting script from Kenneth Branagh's screen Hamlet, a filmed version of the play, which tries to include all of the text. It's a very long film version, again of which we'll be hearing more later, but which is itself a sort of memory of the stage production here in Stratford, which he'd acted in before he made his own film version. And films themselves remember. You know, Hamlet's very much a play about memory, it's about traces, and each of these Hamlet texts remembers things. Film versions of Hamlet often include stage actors associated with the play, so that Zeffirelli's version casts Paul Scofield as the ghost, who'd been a great stage Hamlet in his time. Richard Burton's Hamlet, of which we have a recording over here, was directed by John Gielgud, the great stage Hamlet of a previous generation. This is a play that generates texts, that generates new versions of itself, and even while people are putting it on, they seem to generate more text in the process. Down here, for example, we have the treasured Hamlet workbooks, the notebooks compiled by the actor Sam West when he was rehearsing the role of Hamlet in 2001, which include this rather marvellous detail, a photograph of Sam and his father visiting Elsinore Castle when Sam was 9, as though specially storing up a memory of being with his father at Elsinore just in case he ever had to play Hamlet. Right, so there are lots of Hamlets. Even in Shakespeare's time, there are already versions of Hamlet. Every single Hamlet we get in a book or on stage is a result of many choices. The play is itself haunted. It's a play about a ghost, about the past being still alive in the present and demanding certain things of the present, and it's itself a sort of ghost of itself. I know that sounds paradoxical, but it's that sort of play. As we've already seen, Hamlet has produced an incredible range of books, stage productions, films, radio versions, and so on, all over the world over the 4 centuries since it was first written and performed. What we're going to be looking at over the next couple of weeks is what Hamlet meant, where Hamlet fitted in when Hamlet was new. Starting with Martin Wiggins, one of our specialists here at the Shakespeare Institute in the Theatre of Shakespeare's time, considering what that first production of Hamlet was like.
This is Hamlet. It's also King Lear. It's Richard III. And strange as it may seem to our modern eyes, it's Othello without his makeup. This is Richard Burbage. He's the actor that Shakespeare was thinking of when he wrote all of those parts. If you went to the first ever production of the tragedy of Hamlet, sometime in the autumn of 1600, he is the Hamlet you would have seen. He was 32, and he was the leading actor of the company that produced Shakespeare's plays. He went on playing Hamlet for another 18 years until he died. And when that happened, people said that Hamlet had died, not just Burbage. They didn't think of Hamlet as a role that would be recast, that would pass from distinguished actor to distinguished actor down the generations and through the centuries. And they didn't think of Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, as anything other than Richard Burbage. He was the only Hamlet for English theatre goers. There have been a lot of changes in his life recently when he played Hamlet for the first time. His father, called James Burbage, was a kingpin in the theatrical world. He owned the theatre in which Shakespeare's company performed their plays. It was the first purpose-built theatre in London, and it was a matter of great family pride down into later generations that he was the first builder of theatres in England. But in 1597, James Burbage died, and within a year the theatre's lease expired. The company's professional home turned out to be rather less than permanent, and Richard's inheritance disappeared. A new theatre was planned and built, but to fund it, Richard had to sell shares, rather like a flotation on the stock exchange. His new partners were the actors, and together they saw the Globe Theatre rise out of the mud on the south bank of the Thames. Sometime in the middle of 1599, it opened for business, and about a year later, that is the theatre where Hamlet was first performed. So the first man to play Hamlet had recently lost his father and lost control of his business empire. Sounds familiar. But should we find it significant? Well, perhaps not, because after all, Richard Burbage was first and foremost an actor. It was his job to create characters using his body and his voice and the words that Shakespeare gave him to say. He was prized as an actor in his time for the verisimilitude of the characters he created. What we see him personate, wrote a contemporary, we think truly done before us. What was it like to see the tragedy of Hamlet when it was new? Well, the first thing to realise is that it was never new. It was what we would call a remake. What Shakespeare did in 1600 is what he'd done with Henry V the year before and would do with King Lear 5 years later. He took an old play and he wrote a new version of it. Here's a note of the takings of a production of that earlier version of Hamlet in June 1594, 6 years and a few months before Shakespeare's opened. It's in the account book of the theatre financier, Philip Henslow. He took 8 shillings at this particular performance. It's about £77 in modern money. Seems a bit underwhelming, but then you have to consider that this is already an oldish play being performed at a theatre some way out of town. We can't read this early Hamlet for ourselves because the script doesn't survive. It was eclipsed by Shakespeare's play. All that survives of it is a single line of dialogue that was quoted by another writer in 1596, the insistent, commanding words of the ghost, "Hamlet, revenge." Beyond that, we know what the story must have been. A ghost visits his son, Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, reveals the circumstances of his murder and demands revenge. Hamlet covers his tracks by pretending to be mad, pursues the usurping king, kills him, but is eventually killed himself. So in a sense, the tragedy of Hamlet is a play whose audiences have always already known the story beforehand. So what that means is that the things that made Shakespeare's version of the play distinctive, the things that made it eclipse the previous lost version of Hamlet in the cultural imagination, are the things that Shakespeare particularly brought to it, the value that Shakespeare added, the things that were uniquely his own, the language of the play, the psychological insight of the play. Shakespeare made Hamlet just as much as Burbage.
This week, how would the Elizabethans have understood Hamlet's behaviour? Would they have seen it as an affectation, as sickness, as symptom? This week we'll be hearing from Dr. Erin Sullivan, a specialist here at the Institute in the history of the emotions, as she considers what it meant to an Elizabethan audience to see someone who seemed to be suffering from melancholy.
Perhaps more than any other writer, Shakespeare has been praised for his deep and moving portrayals of human emotion and experience. And of all his plays, Hamlet is the one that has probably attracted the most attention for the way in which it investigates what it means to be a living, thinking, and feeling human being. It's telling, I think, that the most iconic image from the play is that of Hamlet holding and looking at the skull. It's an image of man contemplating himself as man, and in particular how that experience is mediated through the workings of the human mind. But Hamlet isn't just a play about the mind in and of itself. It's a play about the mind in pain and in distress as it tries to come to grips with what's going on in the world around it. In this episode, we're going to think more about the suffering, emotional and existential that Hamlet experiences in this play, and to try to understand more about what people in Shakespeare's time, as well as those more recently, thought about the question, what's wrong with Hamlet? So let's start at the beginning. We first meet Hamlet in Act 1, Scene 2. He's arrived home from university to attend the funeral of his father. The question of what's wrong seems to be obvious. He's mourning the death of what we assume is a much-loved parent. But Hamlet also seems to be angry with those around him. When his uncle Claudius, the new king, addresses him as his cousin and perhaps his son, Hamlet responds, "A little more than kin and less than kind." It's a response that seems to suggest that Hamlet feels that Claudius is getting too close and that he's mistrustful of his intentions. But why? Gertrude suggests that it's the obvious, that it's Hamlet's all-consuming grief for his father that's bothering him. And she tries to remind him that although death is a terrible part of life, it is nonetheless a part of natural life. She says to him, "Thou know'st 'tis common, all that lives must die." And Hamlet seems to agree, saying, "Aye, madam, 'tis common." What Gertrude wants to know then is why Hamlet is insisting on persisting in his grief, especially considering the fact that in Shakespeare's time, and presumably the culture of Hamlet the play as we're experiencing it, grief was thought to be not just a damaging mental and psychological experience, but also a deeply damaging physiological experience. And so in her speech, she's suggesting to Hamlet that he needs to move on, both to preserve his own health and for the good of the court around him. And so she says to him, "Why seems it so particular with thee?" We may not notice anything strange in Gertrude's word choice now, but in Shakespeare's time, being particular was not necessarily such a good thing. It suggested a kind of dangerous abnormality, a separation from the values and beliefs of a shared community, even a kind of perversion. And this idea of particularity, of in somehow being abnormal or strange, is something that has interested audience members and critics and readers for many, many years, in particular in the way they understand this question of what is wrong with Hamlet. Hamlet describes the emotions and ideas he experiences in the play in many different ways, suggesting that they might be a bit particular, but in most cases, at least from his point of view, perfectly normal. But he does say at one point in the play that he is suffering from a kind of illness that he calls melancholy, and that's what we want to find out more about. It happens after the troupe of players has arrived, and Hamlet's watched the player king recite with intense emotion the story of Priam's death and Hecuba's grief. He says, "What's he to Hecuba or Hecuba to him that he should weep for her?" He's talking about this emotional reaction that the player king is having as he says the speech. And then Hamlet says, "What would he do had he the motive and cue for passion that I have?" He seems to be angry with himself in this moment for having such great cause for revenge, but not having done it yet. But then he wonders if in fact the ghost wasn't real, if it was a devil or a demon that's come to trick him and to damn him. He says here that he has a kind of weakness or a melancholy that these kinds of spirits might prey on. And so we might stop now and ask ourselves, what exactly is this melancholy, this sort of delusion that Hamlet's talking about, and what does it mean for our understanding of his mental state? In Shakespeare's time, the health of the mind was thought to be fundamentally connected to that of the body. And the body was thought to be composed of 4 substances called humors that doctors thought existed in the body in equal proportion and were responsible for nourishing the organs, making sure that the process of respiration, digestion, and everything else happened as it should. Now, one of these substances was called melancholy, which was the Greek word for black bile. And along with black bile, there was yellow bile, blood, and phlegm that existed in the body in these equal measures and made it work. The problem was when one of these humors became too extreme, and the body started producing it in greater measure. And so when you had an overproduction of black bile in the body, not only did you have physiological problems or diseases, you might have stomach aches or nightmares or heart palpitations, but you might also suffer from mental problems, anxiety, delusions, unreasonable fears. And it's this problem that Hamlet suggests he might actually be suffering from. Hamlet tells us in the first act that he's going to pretend to be mad in order to buy himself some time to figure out what it is that's going on in the court. And he says to Horatio that perhaps he'll think it meet to put an antic disposition on. And by antic disposition, he means a strange, unruly, even mad sort of way of behaving. It's not long before we hear more about how Hamlet's playing this mad part around the court. In the next scene, Ophelia comes on stage and tells her father, Polonius, that she's met Hamlet and he's been acting very strange. His clothes are all unkempt, his hat's off, he's in a state of disarray, he's saying strange things, and he's looking at her very oddly. And the picture that she paints for us here is one of the stereotypical melancholic lover or madman that would have been familiar to some members of the audience in Shakespeare's time. And Polonius himself also thinks that this is what's going on. He thinks that Hamlet has gone mad for his love for Ophelia and the fact that it hasn't been requited. And this is how he advises Hamlet's mother and King Claudius to proceed in trying to figure out what it is that's wrong with Hamlet. At this point, as the audience, we still have Hamlet's statement in the previous scene that he will put an antic disposition on very much in our minds, leading us to believe that this is indeed an act. But by the time we get to the nunnery scene, when we see Hamlet and Ophelia interacting together, it's a scene that can sometimes be very violent and certainly very emotional. We might start to wonder how much this is indeed an act and how much this emotional excess or maybe even this madness is becoming real. And indeed, Hamlet himself says to Ophelia, "Go to, it hath made me mad." And I think that here Shakespeare is starting to question with audiences where this line between pretense and actuality really lies. There are many points in the remainder of the play where Hamlet continues to make us wonder what's going on with his mental state, where this boundary between madness and sanity lies. In his conversations with Polonius, with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, even with Horatio, there might be points where his language, his dizzying punning, makes us wonder what exactly is happening with his character. Throughout the rest of the play, there are many other points at which Shakespeare invites us to think more about what is happening with Hamlet. In his conversations with Polonius, with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and even with Horatio, he sometimes uses dizzying puns and arguably mad language to play and to question those around him in the court. But we also hear that there's a kind of method in his madness, and that he's only mad north-northwest, leading us to question once again, what is it that is really going on with this character? So what do you think? Is Hamlet's madness always a performance? Or, given what he says earlier in the play about his melancholy, is Shakespeare also toying with the idea that he might actually be going mad? And all of this might lead us to ask the even bigger question, what was madness in Shakespeare's time? And how do we respond to it as audience members and readers today? In this episode, we've looked at the question of emotion, madness, and the mind in Hamlet, both in terms of what people believed in Shakespeare's time about the experience of mental illness, but also in terms of what's going on in the play as we understand it. And in this last section, I'd like to think more about a certain set of readers, that is, psychologists and doctors, and what they've made of Hamlet in the last 200 years or so. It might sound strange to us now, but Hamlet, the character, has become a repeated case study in the writings of many famous psychiatrists and doctors. And most famously was Sigmund Freud, the founder of modern psychoanalysis, who used the case of Hamlet as one way of thinking through his theories of psychosexual development and the experience of neurosis. In his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud used the case of Hamlet to explore what he understood to be an Oedipal complex, that is, the male child's desire to possess his mother emotionally and even sexually in Freud's thinking, and in doing so, to displace his father. Freud wrote about this. Hamlet is able to do anything except take vengeance on the man who did away with his father and took that father's place with his mother. The man who shows him the repressed wishes of childhood realized. Thus the loathing which should drive him on to revenge is replaced in him by self-reproaches, by scruples of conscience, which remind him that he himself is literally no better than the sinner whom he wishes to punish. Though some of Freud's ideas might seem strange to us now, maybe even as strange or stranger than the Renaissance theories of the four humors, it's certainly the case that these ideas have been very influential on the ways that readers and also theater practitioners have subsequently read Hamlet. And in the case of Laurence Olivier's famous film version of the production, which you'll hear about more in this course later on, the idea that Hamlet was drawn to his mother in this deep and strangely sexual way came out very strongly in the way that the closet scene was then performed. In our own time, more recently, performances have also drawn on different ideas from psychology and psychiatry about mental experience and imbalance. For instance, in the most recent 2013 production of Hamlet at the Royal Shakespeare Company, the reviewer Michael Billington noted that the lead actor Jonathan Slinger's performance of Hamlet verged, he said, on the bipolar, suggesting once again this tendency to read what's going on in Hamlet and what's wrong with this character in terms of our own understanding of how the mind works. But perhaps reading the play as so much about the singular and arguably psychotic journey of one man leads us to neglect how much it's also about the collective experience of society in distress. Certainly in Shakespeare's own times, the connection between the health of the individual and that of the greater society, the common health or the common wealth, was fundamental to the understanding of the nature of human experience, and especially the possibility of human happiness.
This week we turn back to Hamlet's long history across time in the theatrical repertory, as we go with Abigail Rokyson, among other places, to Elsinore, to hear from different directors and actors who've staged Hamlet what the different possibilities of its text are on the living stage.
David Bevington begins his book on the production history of Hamlet, Murder Most Foul, by stating that the history of Hamlet can be seen as a kind of paradigm for the cultural history of the English-speaking world. The play has remained a central part of the Shakespeare repertoire, From its first production in around 1600, probably with Richard Burbage in the title role, to its most recent incarnation in the 2013 RSC production with Jonathan Slinger as Hamlet. Each production has found new ways of speaking to its place and time. Peter Hall's 1965 RSC production famously reflected the apathy and disillusionment of the Cold War era, whilst Nicholas Hytner's production at the National Theatre in 2010 spoke to contemporary anxieties about surveillance. Elsinore was a state in which everyone was constantly being watched. Contemporary events and events of the play also found mirrors in Stephen Pimlott's 2001 RSC production, with Samuel West as Hamlet.
We started rehearsing in 2001, exactly 2 weeks after George Bush Jr. was finally confirmed for his first term as President of the United States, after an election which, as you remember, he hadn't actually won. And those events were, of course, in our minds and those of our audience, when Hamlet complains that Claudius had popped in between the election and his hopes, which happens in Act 5, Scene 2.
Just as certain productions have seemed to define their era, so certain actors have seemed to redefine the title role. Haunted by the memories of previous Hamlets, actors perhaps feel a certain pressure to make their Hamlet different. The archetypal student prince, David Warner; the possessed Hamlet, Jonathan Pryce; the insane Hamlet, Mark Rylance; and the awkward teenage Hamlet, Ben Whishaw. Probably the most famous Hamlet was Laurence Olivier. Olivier played Hamlet on stage at the Old Vic in 1937 and on film in 1948. Olivier's Hamlet was praised by the critics for a number of its features, most notably Olivier's intense athletic physicality and the believability of his characterization in comparison to many of those who had gone before him. However, probably the most famous feature of the production was its association with Freud's Oedipus complex, an association from which the play has struggled to free itself in its subsequent production history. In his famous publication Hamlet and Oedipus, which drew on Sigmund Freud's theories, Ernest Jones had argued that Hamlet subconsciously possesses a desire to murder his father and form an incestuous relationship with his mother, and as a result is unable to punish his uncle for what he subconsciously wished to do himself. Olivier and his director, Tyrone Guthrie, went to see Jones, an experience which Olivier claims to have found wonderfully enlightening, asserting that the Oedipus complex may indeed be responsible for a formidable share of all that is wrong with Hamlet. Although in 1937 few critics actually seem to have noticed the production's Oedipal element, this aspect of the production has now been examined in full, and Oedipal interpretations of Hamlet are so common that we now expect to see a bed in the closet scene. Even those actors who have chosen not to play any hint of an Oedipal relationship between mother and son have felt the need to address the issue. Simon Russell Beale, who played Hamlet at the National Theatre in 2000, remarked, "I don't think Hamlet wants to have sex with his mother, even subliminally. He just wants her to stop having sex with his uncle. I don't want to throw her on the bed and that sort of stuff, because you don't treat your mother like that." David Tennant similarly rejected the possibility of an Oedipal interpretation, stating, "It's certainly not something that we discussed. We certainly never rehearsed the scene without a bed, but that decision wasn't made with any sense of a sexual relationship between them." The other actor to have famously played Hamlet both on stage and on film is Kenneth Branagh. Branagh played Hamlet for his Renaissance Theatre Company in 1988, for the RSC in 1992, and then on film in 1996. Professor Russell Jackson worked on Branagh's film. What would he say were its defining features?
Kenneth Branagh's film of Hamlet is unusual insofar as it uses more of the text than any of the other Hamlet films, by which I mean it uses the first folio plus bits of the second quarto, It does a little bit of rearranging, but not a great deal. It takes 4 hours and a bit more to do this. And it doesn't do that to magnify the character of Hamlet himself, but to give more elbow room to the story, to give you a stronger sense of what goes on around him and the life of the other characters. It's filmed in colour very handsomely. It's 70mm, which means that it's in a very wide format, filmed on celluloid, as distinct from the format we usually watch things on, which is a fairly standard old-fashioned format. And this means that it's got a kind of literal breadth as well as emotional breadth. It models itself, in some respects, on films like David Lean's Dr. Zhivago or Lawrence of Arabia. It's also a film that lends itself very well to comparison with two other films in particular. One is Laurence Olivier's 1948 film, very streamlined, the politics cut out, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have gone, there's no Fortinbras, it's a family drama centred on Hamlet and his mother and his stepfather and, of course, the ghost of his father. And the other film I find it very useful to compare Brandes' film with is Michael Almereyda's film, released in 2000, which is set in the world of business in Manhattan, 2000, which is what the first title tells us. It's a young man's rebellion against the corporate world and its iniquities. It uses all the modern media of communication as they existed in 2000, and it really represents a different kind of politics, if you like. So there you've got three Hamlet films, with Brandes' film as a useful touchstone for those other two.
When directing Hamlet, one of the most pressing decisions faced by a director is which text, or rather texts, of Hamlet to use. Hamlet survives in three distinct texts, which vary significantly from one another. The first quarto, published in 1603, the second quarto, published in 1604, and the folio, published in 1623. As this diagram illustrates, what appears to have happened is this. Shakespeare wrote his manuscript of the play, and that original manuscript, or a copy thereof, was used for printing the play in 1604 in what is known as the second quarto. The second quarto is thus the text thought to be closest to authorial copy. Another copy of the manuscript must have gone to the theatre, where it was subject to the usual changes that one might expect from a working script. Censorship, and alterations and cuts by actors, and by Shakespeare himself, who was, after all, a member of the company. This was the manuscript used by Hemmings and Condell when putting together the first folio, and is thought to represent a theatrical copy of the text. And then we have the first quarto, published first, but probably representative of a later stage in the play's journey. There are various theories about the origins of this text, but it appears that it represents some form of memorial reconstruction of the play. It seems that it was made either by a pirate, someone who sat in the audience scribbling down other companies' texts, or by a member of the company as a memorial reconstruction of an abridged text probably designed for touring. The first quarter of the play is notoriously corrupt, with many lines making little sense. For this reason, it was often referred to as the bad quarto, and dismissed as having little or no value. I think, though, that it does have value. Value for performance. It may contain differences that reflect deliberate alterations to the play as part of its performance history. I'm going to explore a couple of possible deliberate alterations to the text which have become part of its mainstream production history. Few productions of the play have actually used the first quarto as the entire basis of their production, although there have been some notable exceptions. One of the earliest and most famous was William Pole's seminal 1881 production at the St George's Hall in London. However, it's become increasingly common in recent years, in productions otherwise based on the first folio or second quarto texts, to use the first quarto's alteration of the order of scenes, moving Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy and the nunnery scene to before the arrival of the players. Numerous productions have used this first quarto structure, including Tony Richardson's 1969 production with Nicole Williamson, Trevor Nunn's 2004 production with Ben Whishaw, and RSC productions including Ron Daniels' 1989 production with Mark Rylance, Matthew Warchus's 1997 production with Alex Jennings, Michael Boyd's 2004 production with Toby Stephens, and Gregory Doran's 2008 production with David Tennant. Why has this proved such an attractive choice for directors and actors? Well, most significantly, it alters the trajectory of Hamlet's journey in the play. In the second quarto and folio versions, Hamlet is initially mourning his father's death.
Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt.
He then encounters the ghost of his father, who tells him that he was murdered by Hamlet's uncle.
Strange and unnatural!
Haste me to know it, that I with wings as swift as meditation or the thoughts of love may sweep to my revenge.
But Hamlet has to test the ghost's words. Almost immediately, a solution presents itself.
Welcome, masters. Welcome, all you are. Welcome to Elsinore. Ah, my old friend. Ooh, my lady and mistress. By a lady, your ladyship is nearer to heaven than when I saw you last. Pray God your voice, like a piece of uncurrent gold, be not cracked in the ring.
The players arrive, and Hamlet hatches a plan.
The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king.
But then the next time we see him, he's seemingly suicidal and desperate.
To be or not to be? Aye. There's the point.
In the first quarto, the alteration of the scene order means that Hamlet encounters the ghost, then expresses suicidal depression, and then the players arrive and the plan takes shape. Hamlet is therefore given a simpler emotional trajectory, more akin to the archetypal revenge hero. For David Tennant, this reordering of the scenes worked because the play seemed to him to be a thriller. Tennant's Hamlet was not a prince who could not make up his mind, but a man who keeps making up his mind and becomes full of energy and certainty, and then hits brick walls here and there. In his 2004 production with Toby Stephens, Michael Boyd not only chose to use the order of the first quarto scenes, he also included a scene unique to the first quarto, a conversation between the Queen and Horatio, which makes explicit the Queen's allegiance to Hamlet following his banishment to England. When I performed the play at Elsinore or Helsingør Castle in Denmark with students from Cambridge University, we chose to include this scene.
This letter I even now received from him, wherein he writes of how he escaped the danger and subtle treason that the king had plotted. As at his next conversion with your grace, he will relate the circumstance at full.
And I perceive there's treason in his looks that seem to sugar o'er his villainy. But I will soothe and please him for a time. The murderous minds are always jealous. And know you not Horatio where he is?
Yes, madam. He hath appointed me to meet him on the east side of the city tomorrow morning.
Fail not, good Horatio. And withal, commend me your mother's care to him. Bid him a while be wary of his presence, lest that he fail in that he goes about.
Madam, never make doubt of that.
Despite the fact that the scene does not fit neatly into an iambic pentameter meter, and some of its lines are mangled, few audience members appeared to notice. If this scene was performed on the early modern stage, or even if it was invented by the reconstructor, it may give some idea of the perception of Gertrude in early performances, in particular of her shift of allegiance to Hamlet. The first quarto is also significant in the different information that it gives us about Hamlet's age. In the folio and second quarto, the conversation between Hamlet and the gravedigger suggests that Hamlet is about 30 years old.
The king's jester.
The gravedigger states that Yorick's skull has been in the earth 23 years, whilst Hamlet famously states,
Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times.
So, if Yorick has been dead 23 years and Hamlet rode on his back, possibly at around 6 years old, then he must be about 29 or 30.
What's that, my lord? Just think Alexander looked to this fashion of the earth. E'en so.
In the first quarto, the time that the skull has lain in the ground is altered to 12 years, implying that Hamlet is around 18. Look you, here's a skull hath been here this dozen year. Let me see. Aye, ever since our last King Hamlet slew Fortinbras in combat. Young Hamlet's father, he that's mad. Whilst many directors choose to cast actors nearer the age of 30 or even 40 as Hamlet, others have felt strongly that Hamlet is a young student. Trevor Nunn had this element of the first quarto in mind when he chose to cast the 24-year-old Ben Whishaw as Hamlet in 2004.
Because I did a production at the Old Vic Theatre in London when I set out to prove these very points. And I did make Hamlet a university student who was aged no more than 20, playing with an Ophelia who was actually 17, and a Gertrude who was actually 42, and wildly biased though I am, I believe that approach constituted something of a breakthrough.
So here we have it. Just a few of the elements that have influenced performances of Hamlet in the 20th and 21st century, and will no doubt continue to influence them into the future.
This week we continue our investigation of Hamlet as a piece for the theatre with the question of what it feels like to play Hamlet. In 2013, the Royal Shakespeare Company were running a production of Hamlet here in Stratford-upon-Avon, and as part of the international conference that's run every year by the Shakespeare Institute's graduate students, I spoke to the actor playing the role of Hamlet, Jonathan Slinger. I started by asking him what the part means to an actor entrusted with it. As we've heard, Jonathan has had an extraordinary run of parts at the RSC, and when you've already done Prospero, when you've already done Richard III, when you've already done Malvolio even, what's different about Hamlet, if anything?
The thing about Hamlet is there's a little bit of everything I've ever done in Hamlet. Hamlet it manages to encompass everything. I mean, I was just saying to Michael upstairs, it's like eating the best meal you've ever had, with every course and every accompanying glass of wine for every course, and every single expressive part of you is satiated by the end. And I feel no need to add anything or to express anything, or to, you know, it's all been said in one performance. And I don't think I realized I didn't realise that till I played it. I played other parts, as you've mentioned, which have been incredibly rewarding to do, which have contained multitudes. But this one contains the lot, and then some.
Does that make you feel empty at the end of a performance, or,
No.
or overfed?
Neither.
Yeah.
Replete and utterly sated and content.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Unless I get it wrong. And then I'm torn with, riven with feelings of regret and self-loathing.
Yeah, which are doubtless very useful to you the following evening.
Yeah,
presumably.
well, that's
Yeah.
the great thing about theatre, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let's face it.
So presumably you have an absolute horror of the run coming to an end.
I do.
Yeah.
More so than any other thing I've ever done. I mean, we are only, I keep being reminded by various members of the cast that we're halfway through. And for many people in the cast, that's we're halfway there, you know. And as time goes on, they will get more excited and more excited by the idea that they can move on to the next thing. I feel like it's slipping from my fingers. And that's a depressing thing for me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the mythology about the part is true, because there's tremendous, I mean, I'm thinking obviously of Withnail and I, that sense that every actor yearns to give his Dane,
Yeah.
and is in danger of feeling that the rest of their career is an anticlimax afterwards. And I've talked to a lot of recovering ex-Hamlets, and very, very few of them have ever really recovered, I have to tell you. And is it all downhill until Lear after Hamlet? or you know, what?
I don't know. I hope not. You know, I hope that doesn't. I hope I don't feel that. Certainly, is there a part? Is there a greater part than Hamlet? No, I don't think there is. I don't think there is. So from that point of view, you know, I will compare every part I've ever played from here on in, and every part I've played since, before it, you know, with it. And they will probably always come up short because they don't contain the same breadth of the enormous range that he contains. And so to a certain degree, I can probably, you know, but then at the same time, I think maybe what Hamlet teaches as well is that it is possible that one person can contain all those things. So if you take that as a template, if you take the character of Hamlet as a template, then maybe what it will do, hopefully what it will do, is to force me to go further and deeper in finding layers within characters that I go on to play, and not to kind of stop and kind of go, well, this character is this and this and this, you know, but to go, well, maybe they're that as well, and maybe they're this as well, and maybe they're also this, you know, because I think maybe that's, I think that's what Shakespeare wrote. He wrote a character, and lots of people think he's impossible to play from this point of view because he seems to be contradictory. I think it's Shakespeare going, this is how complicated a person can be. And I think the challenge with playing Hamlet is to try and convince an audience that that one person can be all of those things over the course of 3.5 hours. Now, whether or not I succeed in that, whether or not anybody has ever succeeded in that, I don't know. But I think that's what Shakespeare was doing. He was going, look at the sheer complexity of human nature. I mean, he did that with all of his works, but I think with that one character, he just went, this one person's going to have the lot. And I think that's possible. I think the human being has that potential.
A lot of Hamlets feel that it's a part that exposes them very much as a result of what you're talking about, that it's going to ask them to do a little of everything that they could possibly do as an actor. and it's going to reveal the limits of their technique or their soul or whatever else it may be. Partly because it seems to be a play where Shakespeare's not that bothered about the story, because he's so interested in who Hamlet is and what how Hamlet feels. I mean, do you feel that this is a nightmare audition piece because you might conceivably have run out of material before you get to the end of the evening?
No, I don't really. I have to say, I mean, I'm still trying to find new levels in it, but I think partly because I went into the business admiring and aspiring to be the actors that I saw that had range. You know, for me, an actor who's very good at playing one kind of thing, I can appreciate what they do and I can kind of go, you know, yes, what you do, that thing that you do is really brilliant, but that for me is not a great actor, actually. And the people that I think are really brilliant are the people who can convince as, I mean, for me, like Kingsley, Ben Kingsley is for all of his Sir Ben nonsense, is just, you know, anybody that can do that unbelievably beautiful humility, which he did with Gandhi and also the character he played in Schindler's List, and the character he played in Sexy Beast. Anybody that can do that, that's, for me, that's, you're a god, you know. So range for me has always been something that I've strove to improve in myself, has been something that I've aspired to, is something that I've always looked up to. And for me, Hamlet is a playground. I mean, it's an absolute romp around the room with all the toys and all the outfits, and you know, and I'm still enjoying finding the different levels of that, and so it doesn't really. I'm not saying I achieve it, but it doesn't. That doesn't scare me. That's something that I relish, actually. I really enjoy.
For any modern actor playing Hamlet, the question of the hero's psychology is pretty much paramount. I asked Jonathan to tell me what his own take was on the prince's behaviour. Does he regard Hamlet as merely melancholy or actively pathological? As we move into the world of the play, I mean, you're on stage during the Century scene at the very beginning, which already seems to send a very clear signal that this is partly a sort of psychological landscape, that we're to see it as focalized through you. And there's a particularly brilliant program note by Erin Sullivan of the Shakespeare Institute about melancholy. To what extent did you treat Hamlet as a sort of clinical study in depression as well as everything else he's doing?
Well, it's interesting because I know David, I think, had an idea right from quite early on that Hamlet was bipolar, and but I never rehearsed it in that way. And for me, if my Hamlet is bipolar, he doesn't know it. He hasn't been diagnosed. He's completely unaware. But I would relish in the differences between the enormous changes of mood between one scene and another. Sometimes, you know, you get this extraordinary move from the grief of Ophelia into the scene with Horatio about the letter and about what he's now going to do. And he has these few lines where he says, "I'm really sorry about Laertes," and, you know, but the grief did put me into a towering passion. And, you know, a lot of these scenes, and once you start to play them, you start to kind of go, my God, he really is jumping around. Emotionally, his moods just seem to go from one extreme to the other. And the amount of feedback I've had from bipolar sufferers and family members of people who suffer from bipolar. It's been really quite extraordinary. And I have a friend who's bipolar who came to see it. She was going to leave at the interval. She found it too much. And then she came back in, and she was very, very kind of disturbed. But, I mean, what she said was, and interestingly from my point of view, because I'd made a decision I wasn't going to play him bipolar, because I didn't want him to be aware. I wanted to play him just going through whatever his emotions were going through. She said what was disturbing was it reminded her of herself before she was diagnosed. And that was very unsettling to her. But ultimately she could deal with it, because now she was on a path to recovery, and she was being medicated, and she could look back and go, my God, that's what I was like, you know. So yeah, it's interesting. The only line which feels like it could be a dialogue is the inflection that I've chosen is to be or not to be. Where I choose to stress is, which has been quite controversial, even within our company. Greg Hicks, who I share a dressing room with, hates it. And he's kind of like, no, it's not, that is the question, that is the question. You've got to hit question. Oh, you know, well. Some people feel that what I'm doing there is going, you've heard this before, and therefore, you know, that's not actually what I'm doing. I know it can sound a bit like that, and in a way maybe I'm slightly having my cake and eating it, because there is something perversely wonderful about kind of going, it's that moment, you know it's that moment, but it is the question. It's the only question. In my mind, actually, what that is he's a depressive. He's not somebody who's thought for the first time to live or not to live. Oh God, that's the question. Yeah, you know, that seemed ridiculous to me, that for the first time in his life he would suddenly happen upon living or not living. Wow, how amazing. Well, you know, that actually he is going to be or not to be. That is the question. That's the only question. It's the only possible question. So that was my thinking behind my inflection on that. But it does sound a little bit like I'm going, you know, you've heard it so many times before, and here it is again, you know. But,
well, we're going to do something deeply counterintuitive for the ultimate outsider, which is, you know, make the noise you must be boringly used to by this stage in your career, which is
never.
Thank you by applauding. Thank you, Jonathan. In this last week, we reach what for many commentators has been the crux of the play, the famous soliloquy, To Be or Not to Be. In the same RSC production in 2013, in which Jonathan Slinger played the prince, the role of Ophelia was taken by Pippa Nixon. She came into the Institute to talk with poet, philosopher and academic Ewan Fernie, who talked with her about that speech and about Hamlet's pathology in general, and especially about what it might mean for Pippa to play Hamlet as a woman.
Hello, I'm Ewan Fernie. I'm one of the professors of Shakespeare Studies here at the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford, and I have the great pleasure today of being here with Pippa Nixon of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Hello, Pippa, and welcome back to the Institute.
Thanks.
Great to have you here. I thought we might, if you're willing, explore today the sort of toothsome possibilities of having a female Hamlet.
Yeah.
And if you'd indulge us further, I thought it'd be good to really dive in at the deep end with Hamlet's most formidable and thrilling soliloquy, "To be or not to be." Would you read that for us?
Of course.
Please? Thank you.
To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to groan and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action.
For such a powerful, sort of massive speech, I mean, it actually starts sort of grammatically quite clearly with a question.
Yeah, to be.
To be or not to be.
Yeah.
Yes. What does Hamlet choose?
To be.
Yes.
Yeah.
He does, doesn't he? Because he, as we sort of track the movements of his mind through your reading, I mean, he doesn't produce the bare bodkin, the dagger, and you're here. The play goes on.
Mm.
But he chooses to be in the most extraordinary way, because everything he says about life presents it as pain and torment. I mean, there's no love, there's no relaxation.
No.
It's purely stress and suffering. And then it seems logical to end it. But for the dread of something after
Absolutely,
death.
yeah.
That's the sticking point, isn't it? That's the thing.
Yeah, it's better to bear those ills we have than the fear of what's going to happen afterwards.
Yeah.
Which is funny, because the life that he chooses to live feels like a death in itself.
Exactly, yeah. So he chooses to be, but actually he'd prefer, everything he says suggests that he's going to choose not to be.
Yeah.
And so he rejects being, he actually chooses not to be. He thinks, I don't want that. I choose not to be. And then he thinks, but hang on a minute, what if I wake up? What if there's more? What if there's something else?
Yeah.
What if there's more being?
Yeah.
He rejects that too.
Yeah, exactly.
So he actually chooses twice not to be.
Yeah.
And that adds up somehow, as you suggest, to a choice to be, but a choice
Yeah.
that's so hollowed out.
Yeah, exactly. Is isolated from life, is isolated from a possible relationship and
Yes.
marriage to Ophelia.
Yes.
In some ways, the prospect of a future as king,
Yes.
which, you know, isn't possible because Claudius has the crown, but it feels like any purpose that a human being needs, that isn't there for him at this present time, apart from what the ghost has asked him to do. But
Yeah. And there's a specific painfulness in relation to gender, isn't there? Because those
Yeah.
two things that you've put your finger on. I mean, he, as a man, as a son, an ageing son, he is sort of withdrawn from marriage and from sexual relationship. He's withdrawn from politics and his expected succession. Hamlet does not succeed Hamlet.
Yeah.
There are references to succession in the play, but Hamlet seems strangely detached from them, all told.
Yeah.
So what we've got is the spectacle of a man who is not sexually active. I mean, it's not often said, but it may well be that Hamlet dies as a 30-year-old virgin.
Yeah.
There's no reason why we shouldn't think so. And I think that is part of the pathos and interest of the play. And he's sort of politically virgin too, and this gives him a strange allure, I think, on the one hand, but also makes him a figure of sorrow and unfulfillment. But, and this is maybe why we're talking as we are, because he doesn't become a politically and sexually active man, because there's this kind of withholding, or I think he has amazing power to sort of appeal to us as almost a pre-gendered self.
exactly, or, you know, and some people see him as a sort of asexual self. I mean, even his friendships with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they've been stunted, and even with Horatio, it doesn't have the sort of finishing point that it could have, but
There's a sense of tender prematurity.
exactly, there is, yeah. It is a role that I think would be incredibly exciting to be played by a woman, and obviously has a history of women playing him, Sarah Bernhardt and Sarah Siddons, and more recently Frances de la Tour. I think that there is something accessible to Hamlet as a woman and the female voice, whether that's chosen to play him as a female, as a man, or whether to play him completely female.
Yes.
And how interesting would it be to see a female with the ghost of her father, and also a female with Gertrude in the closet scene?
Yes, yes. No,
maybe it would heighten the child parent relationship in a way that you take for granted, hearing a son with, or a male voice with those two figures.
Indeed. Yeah. And it probably is necessary at this late date to sort of alter the nucleus of any scene a little bit, as David Farr and yourselves have done.
And I think, you know, any human being can relate to the position that Hamlet is put in. We all know grief, and we all know the trials of this life. It doesn't feel like a big jump for a female to step into the shoes of Hamlet.
Which brings me to the thought, really, that in a way Ophelia is the female Hamlet, or at least might be. Hamlet's sort of lost in a maze of unappealing male alter egos in lots of ways. Pyrrhus and Fortinbras and Laertes, and the pain there is he wants to identify with these men and be more like them, but seemingly in his deepest nature he recoils from that. But given what you've said, you know, perhaps he's looking in the wrong place, and that Ophelia is to him a second self, a possible self, as much as she is, or proves not to be, lover and wife. Does
I completely agree with that. I think, and particularly in the production that we're in currently, there is an equality between Ophelia and Hamlet not in terms of social standing, but certainly in terms of intellect and both knowing pain and sorrow in their lives, but also just in terms of intellectual equals and an identity in one another.
Yes, right.
Which heightens the tragedy of the fact that they can't be together.
Yes.
And in some ways, their demise and their destruction parallel each other throughout the whole of our piece, really, right up until the end.
Yes, because you have that extraordinary sort of intervention in Hamlet on stage, by actually ending with Hamlet and Ophelia, don't you? Hamlet has a sort of moment of sorrow at Ophelia's grave, which has remained on stage, and that is the last thing. And there, Hamlet looking into death and looking into Ophelia's death and mourning it does seem to really resonate with what we've said. I mean, sister, second self, as much as lover, and you know, perhaps what we need to see is Ophelia getting out of the grave in the inky cloak of Hamlet.
I know, exactly. Well, I mean, what's interesting with, and having read the speech of the dread of something after death, and that his final speech where he says, the rest is silence, and then has these 4 O's, which feel like they're leading him into death, and they're directed right at Ophelia. That in some ways that is his vision of death.
I for one, would certainly like to see Ophelia come out of the grave in the inky cloak.
Yeah, in the inky cloak of Hamlet, exactly.